One of the men in this video played an entire NFL game and made the interception that won it, with a plaster cast on each hand, both of them broken. Another kicked a football 63 yards through the goalposts, using a foot that came into the world with no toes on it at all. A third threw for 4 touchdowns and buried his own father in the same 48 hours. And the toughest man of them all let surgeons cut into his body 74 separate times, until the day he sat down, picked up a pen, and signed the form giving them permission to take his right leg off at the knee. These are 10 of the toughest human beings ever to play professional football. Not the greatest, not the most famous, the toughest. Men who played through broken legs, broken hands, shredded shoulders, and grief heavy enough to bury them, and walked back onto that field anyway. Some of them paid for it with the rest of their lives. We're counting them down from 10 to 1. And the man at number 1 gave more of his body to this game than you will believe a human being can give and still smile about it. Number 10. Emmitt Smith. The arm that would not stay down. January 2nd, 1994. The Meadowlands. The Dallas Cowboys and the New York Giants, playing for the division, in the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. Early in that game, Emmitt Smith went down and came up wrong. His right shoulder had separated, the joint pulled apart, the arm hanging like it belonged to someone else. Here is what a normal man does with a separated shoulder. He goes to the locker room. He watches the rest in a sling. Emmitt Smith did not do that. The Cowboys trainers rigged a harness out of a knee pad and a shoelace, taped his throwing side arm tight against his ribs, gave him a painkiller, and sent him back out. His fullback, Daryl Johnston, begged him to stay down. Dallas was winning. There was nothing left to prove. Smith waved him off. And then, one-armed, he carried the Cowboys on his back, running the ball on 9 of 11 plays on the game-winning overtime drive. He finished that afternoon with 168 rushing yards and 10 catches. He won the division with one arm strapped to his side. When his coach, Jimmy Johnson, asked him why, Smith's answer was simple: "Let me play until I can't play." He was not the biggest back who ever lived. On that day, he may have been the most stubborn. But even Emmitt Smith never had to do what our 9th man did, the night his whole world had just fallen apart. Number 9. Brett Favre, the night he played for his father. For 20 years, Brett Favre did something no quarterback in the history of the National Football League had ever done. He showed up. Broken thumb, sprained ankles, hits that folded lesser men, it didn't matter. 297 straight starts. He never once handed the ball to a backup and sat. But the streak was never the real test. That came on December 21st, 2003, when Favre got the call that his father, Irvin, his high school coach, the man who taught him the game, had died of a heart attack. The next night was Monday Night Football, in Oakland, in front of the whole country. No one would have blamed him for going home to Mississippi. His teammates assumed he would. Instead, Favre played. And what he did that night doesn't feel real even now. He threw for 399 yards and 4 touchdowns, all 4 scores, and more than 300 yards in the first half alone. Every throw was a spiral aimed at the sky. By the end, the Raiders crowd, the meanest crowd in football, was on its feet cheering an enemy quarterback. Afterward, Favre said only that he knew his dad would have wanted him to play, and that he was sure his father was watching. Grief will hollow a man out. Brett Favre poured his into a football and threw it as far as he could. His toughness lived in his heart. But the next man's lived somewhere no one would ever believe, in 2 hands that were both broken in half. Number 8. Larry Wilson, the interception with 2 broken hands. Larry Wilson was a free safety for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he invented a way of playing the position so violent that it's still used today. The safety blitz, a small man hurling himself through a wall of giants at the quarterback. But that's not why he's on this list. In late October of 1965, in a game against the New York Giants, Wilson broke a bone in one hand. Then, on a separate play in the same game, he broke a bone in the other. 2 broken hands. The team put casts on both of them, from the knuckles down. Any reasonable man is finished for a month. 1 week later, On November 7, 1965, Larry Wilson took the field against the Pittsburgh Steelers with a plaster club on the end of each arm. The Steelers quarterback, Bill Nelson, later admitted he'd lain awake the night before, unable to shake the feeling that Wilson would somehow pick him off, even with 2 broken hands. And that is exactly what happened. Wilson batted the ball into the air, trapped it against those 2 casts, and returned the interception 35 yards to set up the touchdown that won the game, 21-17. His coach was asked how a man could possibly play with 2 broken hands. The answer: he's too valuable a man in every way to do without. Wilson caught a football with bones that were shattered. Our next man caught 15 stitches to the face and was back on the field before the blood had dried. Number 7. Otto Graham, 15 stitches and a plastic bar. In the early 1950s, football players didn't wear face masks. Their faces were exposed to elbows, cleats, and forearms swung with bad intent. Which brings us to a man most younger fans have never heard of, though he may be the greatest winner the sport has ever produced. Otto Graham played 10 professional seasons. He reached the championship game in all 10 of them and won 7. On November 15, 1953, in a game against the San Francisco 49ers, a linebacker named Art Michaelic caught Graham with an elbow that opened his mouth like a piece of fruit. The gash needed 15 stitches. Graham went to the sideline, let the team doctor sew his face shut right there, and then did something that changed football forever. He had the equipment men bolt a clear plastic bar across the front of his helmet, a crude, improvised shield, and he went back into the game. With his mouth freshly stitched and blood still in it, Graham completed 9 of his 10 passes and led Cleveland back to a 23-20 win. His coach, the legendary Paul Brown, watched that plastic bar and had an idea. Out of Graham's torn mouth came the single-bar face mask, the ancestor of every cage worn on every helmet since. One of the toughest men in football history is the reason the rest of them got to keep their teeth. Graham improvised to finish one afternoon. The next man defied his own surgeon to play the biggest game of his life. Number 6. Terrell Owens, 2 screws and a Super Bowl. 6 weeks before the biggest game of his life, Terrell Owens broke his right leg. On December 19, 2004, a tackle snapped his fibula and tore the ligaments in his ankle. 3 days later, a surgeon put 2 metal screws and a plate into his body to hold the bone together. The recovery timeline for that injury is measured in months. The Super Bowl was 6.5 weeks away. Owens told everyone he'd play. His own surgeon, Dr. Mark Meyerson, refused to clear him, put it in writing, warned that another hit could shatter the leg for good. The doctor essentially told him, if you play, you're on your own. Owens played anyway. On February 6, 2005, in Super Bowl XXXIX against the New England Patriots, a man who could barely walk 2 weeks earlier was on the field for 62 of the Eagles' 72 offensive snaps. He caught 9 passes for 122 yards, running full speed on a leg held together with hardware. Philadelphia lost that game 24-21, and much of what people remember about T.O. is the noise, the feuds, the ego. What they forget is the quietest thing he ever said, standing in that losing locker room. Nobody in this room knew I was going to play this game. Nobody knew but me. Owens played a Super Bowl on a leg the doctors rebuilt with metal. The next man made history on a foot that was never finished at all. Number 5. Tom Dempsey. The kick no one believed. Tom Dempsey was born different. He came into the world with no toes on his right foot and no fingers on his right hand. Doctors told his parents he'd struggle to walk normally, let alone play sports. Dempsey decided to become a professional football kicker, using the very foot the world said was broken. On November 8, 1970, at Tulane Stadium in New Orleans, his Saints were losing to the Detroit Lions, 17-16, with 2 seconds on the clock and the ball 63 yards from the goalposts. Nobody kicked a 63-yard field goal in 1970. The record at the time was 56. The coach sent Dempsey out anyway, mostly because there was nothing else to do. Dempsey, wearing a flat-fronted custom shoe over his half a foot, swung his leg, and drove the ball through the uprights from 63 yards to win the game. It was an NFL record that would stand for 43 years. When critics whined that his special shoe gave him an advantage, Dempsey had a perfect answer. How about you try kicking a 63-yard field goal wearing a square shoe with no toes either? Here is the part the highlight reels leave out. In his final years, Tom Dempsey suffered from dementia and lived in an assisted living home. He died in April of 2020 at 73. The man who kicked the impossible spent his last days unable to remember he'd done it. And that quiet, cruel ending is where these stories start to turn, from what these men could survive to what it cost them. Number 4. Chuck Bednarik, the last 60-minute man. There will never be another Chuck Bednarik, because the game he played no longer exists. In the modern NFL, players specialize, offense or defense, one side of the ball. Bednarik played both. Center on offense, linebacker on defense, snapping the ball and then tackling the men who chased it, for nearly 60 minutes of every game. They called him Concrete Charlie. He'd flown 30 combat missions over Germany as a gunner in World War II before he ever put on a helmet. Football didn't scare him. The proof came on December 26, 1960, at Franklin Field in Philadelphia, in the NFL Championship against the Green Bay Packers. Bednarik was 35 years old, ancient for the sport. On that single afternoon, he was on the field for 139 of the game's 142 plays. Both ways, no rest, at 35. The game came down to the final seconds. Packers driving, one play left to win it. Green Bay's great fullback Jim Taylor caught a pass and churned toward the goal line, and Bednarik, exhausted, filthy, a two-way Ironman at the end of 60 minutes, wrapped him up and dragged him down at the 9. And then he simply sat on top of Taylor, pinning him to the frozen grass, watching the clock run out. When the final gun sounded, Bednarik got up and said the only thing worth saying, "You can get up now, Jim. The game's over." He is the last man who will ever play an entire championship on both sides of the ball. But even Bednarik walked off that field on his own. The next man had to be helped, bleeding, into a photograph that would haunt the sport for 60 years. Number 3. Y.A. Tittle, the photograph that told the truth. You have probably seen the picture, even if you don't know the name. An old quarterback, kneeling in the end zone, his helmet knocked off, blood running down his bald head in dark streaks, his body slumped, done. It is one of the most famous images in the history of American sports, and the man in it is Y.A. Tittle. It was September 20th, 1964, at Pitt Stadium. Tittle was 37, near the end of a 17-year career, and a Pittsburgh lineman named John Baker drove him into the ground as he threw. The pass was intercepted and run back for a touchdown. Tittle got up slowly, then sank to his knees, unable to rise. He had a cracked sternum and a concussion. A photographer named Morris Berman snapped one frame. Incredibly, his own newspaper editor refused to print it at first. He wanted action shots, not an old man bleeding. The photo only became famous later, after it won awards. And here's what makes that image matter for us. For a long time, America looked at that photo and saw something noble. The warrior, spent, glorious in defeat. What we didn't understand then was the truth behind it. That Tittle's body was a wreck of collapsed lungs, broken hands, a crushed cheekbone, and fractured vertebrae. And that thousands of men like him would spend their afterlives paying for those Sunday afternoons. That kneeling photograph wasn't a portrait of glory. It was a warning nobody was ready to read. Our next man saw the same warning and taped his broken leg back together to play a Super Bowl anyway. Number 2. Jack Youngblood. Tape it up, Clarence. Jack Youngblood was a defensive end for the Los Angeles Rams, and for 201 straight games, he simply did not miss. But it's what he did on a broken leg that put him in the Hall of Fame, and this high on this list. On December 30th, 1979, in a playoff game against the Dallas Cowboys, Youngblood fractured his left fibula, a broken leg. The season, for him, should have been over right there. He limped to the team doctor, Clarence on the sideline, Shields looked at him and said, "Jack, you've got a broken leg." Youngblood's reply became legend. "Tape it up, Clarence." And they did. They wrapped and braced that broken leg, and Youngblood went back in and kept going. He played the entire NFC Championship game on the fracture. Then he played Super Bowl XIV against the Pittsburgh Steelers on it, chasing quarterbacks up and down the field on a bone that was cracked in two. The Rams lost that Super Bowl, 31-19. And then, 1 week later, still broken, Youngblood flew to the Pro Bowl and played in the All-Star Game too, because, as he put it, he wasn't going to miss the party. 3 games, 1 broken leg, no complaints. It's the kind of toughness that sounds made up. It isn't. But there is one man whose body gave more to this game than anyone who ever lived. A man who let it take his leg entirely. Number 1. Jim Otto, 74 times under the knife. For 15 seasons, the center of the Oakland Raiders wore the number 00, and he never missed a single game. 210 times in a row, Jim Otto lined up over the football, put his hand in the dirt, and hurled his body into 300-pound men. He was the toughest player on the toughest team of his era, and the game took everything from him for it, piece by piece, over the next 50 years. It started with his knees, ground to powder by the time he retired. Then it spread. Over the decades, Jim Otto went under the surgeon's knife roughly 74 times, both knees replaced. Infections that nearly Ain Verin sees killed him 3 separate times. Once, he flatlined on the operating table. For 6 months, he lived with no knee joint in his leg at all, just a gap, waiting for an infection to clear. And finally, on August 1st, 2007, Jim Otto sat with the doctors and signed the paper and let them amputate his right leg at the knee. He gave the game his leg. And still, he never once said he was sorry he'd played. Remember the 2 casts and the interception nobody thought was possible? Remember the toeless foot that kicked 63 yards? Remember the broken leg taped up for a Super Bowl? The 15 stitches, the shoulder strapped to a man's ribs? Every one of those men earned his place on this list by what he could survive. Jim Otto stands at number 1 for something else, for what he gave away. When they asked him how he endured it, he didn't flinch. "Pain is a state of mind," he said. "I got used to it. If my nose wasn't broken during a game, I wondered if I'd played hard enough." He wrote a memoir and called it The Pain of Glory. He died in May of 2024, at 86 years old, on an artificial leg, and to the very end, he swore he would do every bit of it over again. That is the toughest man ever to play the game. Not because he hit the hardest, because he gave the most, and never asked for a single piece of it back. If this story moved you, take a moment and subscribe. These are the stories behind the helmets, and we tell them honestly. And tell us in the comments, which of these men do you remember watching live? Were you in New Orleans the day Tom Dempsey kicked the impossible, or did your father ever tell you about Chuck Bednarik playing all 60 minutes? We want to hear who the toughest man you ever saw play really was. Thank you for watching the complete video. Did you know? Americans over 60 lost $7.7 billion to scams last year. That's according to the FBI. In 2020, that number was just 600 million. These aren't careless people. These are retired teachers, veterans, business owners, losing an average of $83,000 each. Now ask yourself this. Could you spot a phone call that uses your grandson's cloned voice, begging for help? Would you recognize a fake email from your bank that looks exactly like the real thing? Do you know what to do in the first 60 minutes after your personal information is stolen? If you hesitated on any of those, you're not alone. And that's exactly why we started The Lookout, a newsletter with 1 email per week. No spam, no politics. Just the latest scams explained, how they work, and exactly how to protect yourself and the people you love. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. It costs nothing. It takes 2 minutes to read, and it might save you everything.